Well, hello everyone. It's time to get started with Tree School Online. It's 3 o'clock. So first, hello, I'm Glenn Ahrens. I'm your OSU Extension Forester for Clackamas, Marion, and Hood River counties. And it's my pleasure to be your host for today's Tree School Online webinar. A little bit of housekeeping. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. I want to give special thanks to the Oregon Forest Resources Institute for leading this project, and to the U.S. Forest Service and the Oregon Department of Forestry for giving us a grant to cover expenses. The Tree School webinars are offered every second Tuesday of the month, and this is our second to last one in the series here in 2022, so there's one more coming in April. Please visit the Tree School Online page, webpage on the knowyourforest.org website for updates. And also note that we are working on plans for in-person tree school classes, starting with field classes that we hope to be able to offer later this year. And then we're also holding out hope for more of the in-person tree schools at Clackamas Community College and other locations in 2023. Some more housekeeping details. The Zoom toolbar should be located at the bottom of your screen. And if you don't see it, you can scroll your cursor over that area. It should pop up. And on some hardware, such as Macs and iPads, that toolbar might be on the top, and many features are accessed from there. Your audio as participants is going to be muted, and the video is also not available for participants other than your panelists. We'd like you to put written questions in the Q&A box. So you should see that in the Zoom toolbar, and you can type in written questions. And as we go, as you think of the question, put it in that so that we can get it when we get to our question and answer periods. And we're asking that you put your questions there, and that the chat should be used if you're having problems. My co-host, Julie Woodward from Oregon Forest Resource Institute, is monitoring the chat and be looking at that if there's any issues that come up or other communications that you want with each other or with the panelists. Resources can be found on the Tree School Online class guide, and you can reach that again from the Tree School Online webpage of the knowyourforest.org site. And if you look at the webinar descriptions and then look for the webinar of interest, you can see the description and link to the resources. So this webinar will be recorded, and then it will be up with the resources that our speaker, Kirk Hanson, provides probably within a few days. And then all of our past Tree School online courses are there for you to visit the library. We're going to offer professional logger credits with Associated Oregon Loggers. You can also access those through the resources. The webinars are recorded, as I mentioned, and be archived as YouTube videos and accessible from the Tree School Online pages. We're going to use some polls here and just get a take on you, our audience. And then at the beginning, we'll ask some questions about yourself, and then at the end, we'll have an evaluation poll. Those will pop up on your screen in a little box, and after you answer questions, you can close the poll. If you don't see the poll, check in the Zoom toolbar for a lighted button, and if the button appears, you should be able to pop up the poll. Also with that, I want to have a little disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed by our speakers are theirs and theirs alone, not those of OSU, OFRE, or the Partnership for Forestry Education. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. So Kirk, if you will, go ahead and show up there on the video. Kirk Hanson is the director of the Northwest Natural Resources Group. Kirk is a small woodland owner with over 200 acres of family-owned forest land in Western Washington. And he's worked on behalf of small woodland owners for more than 25 years, bringing his passion for ecological forestry and simplified hands-on management practices that allows forest owners to take a direct role in the stewardship of their own land. As a member of a 3-generation family-owned forest, Kirk understands the issues and opportunities facing small woodland owners, and he relishes developing new strategies for optimizing economic and ecological potential of their forests. Kirk worked for 6 years with the Washington Department of Natural Resources Small Forest Landowner Office before joining Northwest Natural Resources Group in 2006. And it's been my pleasure to work with Kirk for many years in our mutual passion and interest of helping family forest owners. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kirk, to give your intro, and then we'll stop for the poll, and then off we go.
Sure. Thanks, Glenn, and thanks, Julie. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all. Fairly short intro, so I'll save a little more detailed intro for when I get into my presentation. But for the next hour or so, I want to share with you some of the principles of what I consider to be ecological forestry that I've gleaned over the past 25 years of my experience as both a forest owner and manager and a consulting forester working all across Western Washington and a little bit down into Western Oregon. We'll get about halfway through my presentation. I'll take a break and give an opportunity for some questions, a little bit of feedback, and then jump into the second half of my presentation. And at the very end, if there's time, I'd love to show a brief, about a 5-minute video on some work that I and my organization are doing up in the Ashford area of Washington with the Nisqually Community Forest that will tie together everything that I talk about over my presentation. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Glenn.
All right, thanks, Kirk. So I'm going to put up the poll now. And if you would just answer a few questions about yourselves, just to help Kirk get to know who's in the audience. Starting out with where you're from, and if you're a woodland owner or a natural resource professional or other, and if you do own land, how many acres? Those are the main questions. Looks like folks are getting started on that, so I'll get you through that. It only takes about a minute until everyone that wants to participates. Well, we're about to surpass 90%, so I think we've probably hit the magic number. Okay, very good. All right, last chance. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So we should be able to see that about over 2/3 of us are from the Willamette Valley in Oregon. There's some from coastal Oregon, Southwest Oregon, Eastern Oregon, and a couple from Washington State as well, Kirk. Then as far as forest owners, again, about the same, 70% are woodland owners, and then another good portion are private natural resource professionals, and also a scattering of other besides that. And as far as acreage goes, pretty much across the board, less than 20% do not own land, but then 10 acres or less, all the way through to over 1,000 acres, pretty even distribution of landowners from small to up to 100 to 1,000 acres. So that tells you who's out there, Kirk. And with that, I'll let it go back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks again, Glenn. So like Glenn said, I'm the Director of Forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group. And for those of you that are not familiar with us, we're a nonprofit organization dedicated to researching and implementing principles of ecological forestry in the Pacific Northwest. I myself have been a consulting forester for over 25 years. And like Glenn mentioned, I'm also a member of a 3-generation tree farming family that owns over 200 acres of forest land up here in Washington State. So I tend to go from practicing forestry during the week to practicing forestry on the weekends. It's a rather chronic merger of both my vocation and avocation, but I'm okay with the lifestyle. So I speak a lot to mixed audiences who invariably and understandably have mixed reactions to what I have to say about forest management. So therefore, I want to start this conversation by stating very specifically how I define ecological forestry and where I feel its principles are best applied. My use of the term ecological forestry refers to the observation of natural forest development processes and how we can emulate these processes to the extent possible in the management of our forests to improve their ecological functions and their resilience. So the purpose of this presentation is really to lay out a thought process and to provide forest management options specifically for forest owners and managers who are interested in improving the ecological functions of their forests. The types of forest owners who will likely be most interested in principles of ecological forestry are conservation groups, land trusts, small woodland owners or family forests like myself, public agencies, tribes, Um, Although principles of ecological forestry can also be woven into the practice of industrial forestry, and often are when protecting streams and wetlands, steep slopes, or habitat for rare, threatened, endangered species, et cetera. Industrial forestry is designed for the very specific purpose of maximizing the production of wood fiber and or net present value to shareholders. So if your primary objective is timber production, then the agronomic model of plantation forestry, sometimes referred to as tree farming, is where it's at. Okay, so to be very clear, I'm not here to tell you that ecological forestry is a viable alternative to or even can compete with the short-term productive capacity of plantation tree farms. Given domestic and global demand for wood products, there will always be a need for the industrial production of trees, much like there is a need for the industrial production of agricultural crops to feed our growing population. So I'm not here to cast doubts on industrial forestry. Our society needs it. I'm here instead to share forest management alternatives for forest owners who are interested in providing a broader range of ecosystem services and public benefits. I'm also here to advocate for restoring older forest habitat that, due to the conversion of our region's primary forest to other uses, is now a vastly underrepresented ecosystem on our landscape. And with the loss of older forests has gone a unique suite of ecological functions that younger forests cannot provide. So this presentation, when I originally put it together, I was titled, "This Ain't Your Grandfather's Forestry," as I wanted to highlight the constantly renewing body of science that is driving the practice of modern day ecological forestry. But the title wasn't entirely appropriate, as regardless of the science, we are in practice implementing forest management strategies that have been used by old farmers, generations of forest owners, and when you get down to the principle level of the practice, really by humans for millennia. The title also became ironic for me because everything that I originally learned about the ethic and practice of good forest stewardship came from my father, the grandfather of my kids, whose wisdom is now trickling down to their generation. So my family owned 80 acres of forest land in the St. Croix River Valley, a couple hours north of St. Paul, Minnesota. And over the course of the first 20 years or so of my life, my family frequently traveled to the land, as we called it, and tinkered with various forestry activities. We cut enough firewood to heat our house all winter. We tapped sugar maples and made maple syrup. We took spring water home for drinking. Not being hunters ourselves, my dad leased the annual hunting rights to our property for the value of the annual land taxes. We cross-country skied, we hiked, we camped, we picnicked, we played, and overall developed an awe and appreciation for nature. Later, my dad took oak logs to a local small mill and had them turned into lumber, from which he made various items, including this set of heirloom quality craftsman style living room furniture for my family. My parents were of the Aldo Leopold School of Conservation. If you're a careful steward of the land will support you. Throughout their entire tenure on that land, my parents planted white pine beneath the hardwood dominant forest canopy. Now, white pine was the original old growth across much of the Midwest before a couple brothers from Wisconsin by the last name of Weyerhaeuser started a timber company and began logging their way west. Before my parents sold a conservation easement on their land to the Minnesota Land Trust and eventually the land altogether to another private owner, the crowns of the white pine had just begun emerging through the canopy of hardwoods. So a key tenet of ecological forestry is that when we manage forests for biodiversity, we're provided with more diverse opportunities for goods and ecosystem services. The story of Ma and Pa Hanson is really a story of ecological entrepreneurialism. They recognize the wide range of values in a forest and sought to utilize many of them. Now, I'm a consulting forester by profession, and when I tell people that I'm a forester, I often get a puzzled reaction. So apparently fewer and fewer people realize there's a profession of managing, not just logging forests. So I work with people who own or manage forest land on all different scales, from 5 acres to well over 100,000 acres, and help them decide how to manage their forest to meet their objectives. And that's always the first place that I start. What are your objectives? Adding to this list of broad objectives that my parents managed for are other common objectives that folks express to me these days: carbon sequestration, commercial timber production, flood mitigation, etc. And as you get into the practice of forest management, you quickly begin to learn that you can't optimize all of these goals simultaneously. Some of these goals are just incompatible with others. Regardless of how diverse a forest may be, it can't provide for 100% of our needs everywhere all of the time. Now, I'm often approached by forest owners who tell me that they want to optimize carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, biodiversity, fire resilience, climate adaptation, etc. Now, those all sound like laudable goals, right? But these clients are often disappointed and wonder if they've hired the wrong guy when I say, I can't do that for them. I can't optimize all of those values, as some of them are incompatible with each other in either the short or long term, or both. There have to be trade-offs. So the first principle of forest management you have to learn is to compromise. However, a lot of these goals are compatible, or compatible to a lesser or greater degree. And if we prioritize them, we can develop silvicultural systems that emphasize a range of goals. So that's the frontispiece to my presentation. It kind of sets the stage for what I want to share with you this afternoon. And here's where I want to go from here. I will provide an overview of forest ecology in the Pacific Northwest. I will discuss some of the ecosystem services forests, in particular older forests, provide. I want to make an argument for actively managing our forests in a manner that emulates old forest structure and functions versus taking solely a passive approach to achieving conservation objectives. I will talk about climate change and how it may affect the forests in our region. Then I'll give you an overview of forest management strategies we can use that emulate natural forest development processes and are intended to restore ecosystem services while providing other societal needs, such as jobs, revenue, valuable forest products, etc. And then again, if we have time, I'm going to close with a short video that we put together on the forest management philosophy we're using at the Nisqually Community Forest up in Ashford, Washington, that should tie everything together. And I also want to point out that the majority of the photos I use in this presentation are either of forestry projects I've worked on, or I'm currently working on, or from forests that I've studied. So first, I want to give you a primer on how forests in our region develop, some basic principles of ecology that shape forest composition, and some key structural and functional characteristics of natural forests. So we have a baseline to work from when we begin talking about how nature can serve as a model for active forest management. All forests are born from disturbance. A young forest begins its journey to old growth on a site that was disturbed from its prior condition. Now, there are many natural disturbance events that will either reset a site back to zero or alter the conditions of the site enough to stimulate the natural regeneration of a new cohort of trees. Now, Mount St. Helens may be the most dramatic example where the forests within the blast zone were literally reset to zero. A wind disturbance or ice storm, on the other hand, is a more moderate example, as not all of the trees are blown down. A lot of legacy structures, such as both live and dead trees, remain, along with a lot of down dead wood that feeds an elaborate nutrient system. Along with the heterogeneous distribution of trees that endure natural disturbance events, there are also often a myriad number and species of tree seedlings in the understory that combined set the stage for the next generation of forest, depending on the nature of the disturbance. So common natural disturbance events include fire, windstorms, ice storms, landslides, disease, insects, drought, Certainly another common disturbance regime is humans, with land clearing for agriculture or development, logging, etc. From any of these disturbance events begins a chain of sequence referred to as natural succession. Often, natural succession begins with a site becoming rapidly colonized by a pioneer species, such as red alder on wetter soils or Douglas fir on drier soils. These species tend to seed into a disturbed site at a high density, aggressively outcompete most other species, and typically form a monocultural stand of trees. Now, eventually, the dense seedlings close canopy, and the developing stand enters what is called the competitive exclusion phase, as individual trees compete with each other for increasingly limited resources such as sunlight and soil moisture. Now, through the good old-fashioned process of natural selection, some trees achieve dominance over others, and the less dominant trees eventually succumb to suppression mortality as they fail to adequately compete for limited resources. So take a look at this diagram that shows the relationship of trees to one another in the canopy of the forest. As competition occurs between the trees, some trees achieve dominance, D. Some trees are slightly less dominant or co-dominant, C. Some trees start becoming subordinate in the stand or achieve an intermediate position in the canopy, I. And then some trees become suppressed beneath the closing canopy of the forest, S. Now, eventually, these latter trees may succumb to suppression mortality, M. Now, many stands can remain in this competitive phase for decades, for well over 100 years, even before they gradually thin themselves out and create opportunities for other plant species, trees and shrubs to enter the stand. Given enough time and the absence of additional disturbance events, these formerly homogeneous stands will gradually succeed to increasing species and structural diversity. As trees continue to succumb to suppression mortality or other mortality agents such as disease and storm damage, they convert to increasingly larger snags or dead trees that provide a habitat for well over 100 species of wildlife. As trees fall in the forest, they add increasingly larger down logs to the forest floor that also provide a habitat for over 400 species of insects, which in turn support an elaborate food chain. As gaps form in the forest canopy due to disease or windstorms, they create opportunities for other species of trees and shrubs to enter the forest. And in areas where the canopy remains dense, more shade-tolerant trees, such as western red cedar or western hemlock, may establish themselves and begin their long journey to eventually eclipse the dominant but less shade-tolerant Douglas fir. Now, at a broad landscape level, a region can be divided into different forest zones or vegetation zones based on which tree species eventually achieves dominance. Two forest ecologists at Oregon State University, Jerry Franklin and C.T. Dernis, in the 1970s, created a system of broad vegetation types that is still used today. Most of Western Oregon and Washington, for instance, is considered to be in the Western Hemlock Forest Zone. This means that if given no other major stand replacing event, Western hemlock will eventually achieve dominance and become the climax species on most sites. Now, this is largely due to its shade tolerance and that it gradually succeeds the less shade tolerant Douglas fir. Within these broad forest zones, however, are subzones such as the Puget Lowland Douglas fir zone that occurs primarily on droughty glacial soils, or the Sitka spruce zone along the coast, or the silver fir zone above 3,000 feet. That is an outcome of elevation and rainfall and temperature. Now, in these microclimates, there are specific influencing factors that contribute to other species than western hemlock eventually achieving dominance. Now, we are becoming increasingly aware of the value of ecological services that complex forest ecosystems provide. As we weigh the logistics and costs of addressing some of the ecological problems we face, such as flood mitigation, climate change, endangered species, wildfires, we're beginning to realize that restoring the ability of nature to resolve these problems is not only less expensive and more effective than engineering solutions, but provides a broad range of co-benefits. So let's also take a moment and look at the ecological significance of older forests, as their performance metrics are singularly unique compared to the younger forests that they've been replaced with. Let's start with carbon. Old growth forests store nearly 4 times the volume of carbon than younger plantations do, and stored in a manner that is more resilient to disturbance and loss than younger forests. Older forests contain a higher volume of critical habitat structures, such as large snags and down logs, as well as habitat features that are important to rare, threatened, endangered species. Primary forests can contain an average of 90 snags and 90 down logs per acre, whereas 3rd or 4th generation plantations may contain none. Now, when we began the forest management planning process for the Nisqually community forest up near Ashford, Washington, we worked with the EPA to model changes to watershed hydrology using different forest management scenarios. One of the outcomes of this modeling exercise was the revelation that forests older than 60 to 80 years have the capacity to retain more water higher in the watershed longer into the summer and can increase summer stream flow by more than 3 times the volume of younger forests. This is primarily due to the high transpiration rate of young, rapidly growing forests. Now, this was a critical finding for us as the community forest sits at the headwaters of the Mayshell watershed, a stream and river system that supports an endangered population of steelhead that rely on cool summer stream flow for their survival. Now, old growth forests contain significantly more biodiversity than young, highly simplified plantations, and we're still discovering new species that occupy the complex forest structure of older forests, from epiphytes in the canopy to biota in the soil. Timber production. On average, given the soils and climate of the Pacific Northwest, forests are capable of producing about 800 board feet of timber per acre per year on a sustained basis once they reach about 50, 60 years old. So by way of comparison, it takes approximately 20,000 board feet to build an average 1,400 square feet, 1,400 to 1,600 square foot home. So every 25 acres of maturing forest is capable of producing enough lumber for a home just by skimming the interest, the annual growth off the top, not even touching the principal. So at today's log values, this represents about $16,000 of gross log value that can be generated from those 25 acres every year, not to mention the added value and jobs as these logs are processed into usable materials. Now, not surprisingly, more and more people have been coming to my organization asking, how do we restore old growth forests and all the values they provide? And in fact, based on this overwhelming interest, we hosted a workshop a few years ago titled How to Grow Your Own Old Growth in 300 Years or Less. And it was our most popular workshop ever. Now, although there are some features of old growth forests that just require time, there are active management strategies we can apply to younger forests that can accelerate the development of old growth characteristics and functions in a much shorter time. Now, utilizing management strategies that emulate natural disturbance and stand development processes is therefore, I believe, the practice of ecological forestry. So that's the prelude to my presentation. I now want to start talking about actual forest management because this is where it gets really fun. This, the very first premise that we need to start with is, well, think about this. The very first premise that we need to start with is that there are too many damn trees out there. We've converted 95% of the original old growth forests across the Pacific Northwest to other uses, primarily to plantations stocked with trees at a very high density. A friend recently sent me this tagline that followed the signature in an email she received from an individual who works for a timber company. And aside from the advocacy of wanton wastefulness, the claim that we have more trees in the US today than we did 100 years ago is incredibly misleading. Converting a modestly stocked old growth forest to a highly stocked plantation may net you more trees per acre, but there are few other ecological equivalencies. So let's assume then that our objective is to restore older forest structure and functions to the younger forests that we are currently working with. Our single most effective tool to achieve this objective is thinning, and in fact, using multiple thinnings over time. Why? Let me give you a scenario that will help put things into perspective. When I hike in old growth forests across the Northwest, regardless of if they're coastal, in the Olympic Mountains, the Cascade Range, I often find that the stocking density of the very large dominant trees averages between 50 and 100 trees per acre. Now that's just considering the large canopy trees. There may be innumerable understory seedlings and saplings beneath these dominant trees, but when most people visualize old growth forests, they think of the big ones. And those account for around 50 to 100 trees per acre. Now, there's always going to be some variation to this. We're talking about complex, heterogeneous ecosystems that are shaped by highly localized microclimatic natural disturbance regimes. All right, but let's stick with this metric for right now. So these 50 to 100 trees per acre represent the carrying capacity for a site. And carrying capacity refers to the ability of an ecosystem to support a given population of a particular organism, trees in this case. So if we're starting with a plantation or a naturally regenerated forest for that matter, then we're likely starting with a forest that has more than 300 to 400 trees per acre. Now, it should be immediately logical that we have two pathways to get to our desired future condition. One, we let nature run its course, let the stand self-thin through the competitive exclusion phase and gradually succeed to older forest structure and functions. Or two, we thin to accelerate that process. Now, I'm asked by many conservation groups, why can't you just lock the gates and let nature run its course? And my response is, well, you certainly can. I think it's a perfectly legitimate option in some locations. But there are also consequences to doing nothing, the outcomes of which may be in conflict with some of our objectives. Specifically, highly stocked stands often lack resilience and are highly susceptible to disturbance. And let me give you some reasons why. First of all, trees that grow in competition with one another achieve a high height to diameter ratio as they compete for sunlight. That makes them very susceptible to breakage during wind and ice storms, as well as at a stand level, highly susceptible to large-scale blowdown. High stocking densities often result in highly stressed trees, as they are all competing for increasingly limited resources. Highly stressed trees are more susceptible to insects and diseases. If the limiting resource is water, highly stocked stands are also much more prone to drought-induced mortality. Highly stocked stands accumulate large amounts of dead biomass, and the simplified stand structure comprised of smaller diameter trees is highly susceptible to forest fires. Now, highly stocked and homogeneous stands provide very simplified habitat features and have a reduced value to wildlife. Lastly, highly stocked stands result in very slow-growing trees, which delays the ability of the forest to produce merchantable timber products and may result in overall lower value timber. So I think this is a good moment to make an aside about carbon sequestration, as increasingly people are asking me, how can we optimize forests for carbon? First of all, to be perfectly honest, if our sole objective is to maximize the ability of a forest to sequester and store carbon, then the best management strategy is to do nothing. Forests in the Northwest, and this is presumably true elsewhere, will optimize photosynthetic leaf surface area, which drives primary production of biomass, and remain in a near optimal biomass accumulation phase for many decades, if not centuries, until the ecosystem reaches a steady state equilibrium between biomass accumulation and decay. Even though individual tree growth will slow down in an overstocked and highly competitive forest, at the stand level, there is still rapid biomass accumulation occurring. As suppressed trees succumb to mortality, live biomass gets converted to dead biomass, but from a carbon standpoint, there is still a net positive accumulation occurring across both live and dead pools of carbon in a forest. Now, recently, my organization conducted a thought exercise to compare the differences in carbon sequestration in the same forest managed under 4 different silvicultural regimes over a 160-year period of time. We started with a Douglas fir plantation planted in 1980 at a standard density of 350 trees per acre. And the 4 silvicultural regimes that we modeled included clear cutting every 40 years, extended rotation or clear cutting on 80-year cycles, thinning every 20 years, and then 4th, no management. And we used an open source forest growth model developed by the US Forest Service called the Forest Vegetation Simulator, or FVS, to run the scenarios. And this model takes into consideration the dynamics of carbon in several different pools, forest products, and landfills, and assigns both growth and decay rates for each. Now, quite demonstrably, the no management scenario shows superior results in carbon sequestration. Perhaps not surprisingly, the business as usual 40-year rotation pathway performed the worst, as a lot of carbon gets lost during the logging and manufacturing process, and a lot of carbon also quickly ends up in landfills, where it then becomes a carbon source again. Extended rotation and thinning perform considerably better, as more carbon remains in the forest and there are less opportunities for consistent losses throughout the logging and manufacturing process. Now, as an advocate of active forest management, I found it particularly noteworthy that the total carbon sequestration rate under a thin-only regime was not too far off from the no management. And this is partly due to keeping a forest in a near optimal growth phase while consistently converting some portion of the timber to long-lived forest products. However, the wild card in this whole modeling exercise is that FVS, the computer model, cannot predict and therefore model the effects of natural disturbance. And therefore, the superior results of the no management scenario I find are somewhat dubious. So if we can absolutely guarantee that this forest will not be adversely affected by any type of natural disturbance, then arguably, yeah, the right course of action is to do nothing and just let it grow. However, as a friend of mine once said, if you want to know how to make nature laugh, just tell her your plans. So with the assumption that natural disturbance happens, and given the fact that we likely have more objectives than solely carbon sequestration, then I think we're back to the justification for active management, thinning. And our goal should be to manage for resilience, in particular relative to climate change, so we can help ensure that the forests in our region can sequester and store carbon for the long term. So I promised to start talking about forest management, but I want to take a little break here. I'm about halfway through. I'm going to get in next talking a little bit about climate change and how that affects Northwest forests, and then finally get into some silvicultural strategies. So with that, I just want to open up, take a break for, I think, about 5 minutes or so and see if there are any initial questions in the first part of my presentation. And Glenn, I don't know if you have anything else that you'd like to add at this point or ask of folks.
Well, I'm just looking to others to ask questions of you. I don't see any questions in the Q&A right now. I might quickly ask in that carbon sequestration modeling scenario, were you accounting for forest products in that, or was that just the forest biomass and carbon?
Yeah, FES models three pools: the biomass in the forest, the biomass that gets converted to forest products, and then in that conversion process, how much biomass ends up in landfills in a fairly short order. So those are the three main pools that it's modeling.
Yeah, I mean, actually, when you start talking about the actual management scenarios and strategies for, resilience, the question of reality of, how much does thinning maybe reduce the likelihood of catastrophic disturbance like wind throw? I could just see all kinds of things that would change those, the actual reality of what happens. And the assumption that nothing happens seems like that's the one thing that we know is not going to be true.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's where a friend of mine who does a lot of this kind of modeling says, all models are always wrong, but they're sometimes useful.
Yeah.
So I think what they're handy for is looking at some trends and doing some comparative analysis. But yeah, hence my disclaimer that the no management option both is difficult to model, just given the chaotic nature of natural disturbance, each of those pathways is you have to take with a certain grain of salt. So I think again they're useful for comparative analysis, but to be taken literally.
Here's an important question.
Right.
Where do hardwoods fit in your dynamics?
I'm going to talk a little bit about hardwoods in the second part of my presentation. So hold on to that. And if I don't touch on specifically what you're interested in, ask that again at the tail end.
Okay.
Great question.
Another one is biomass energy the result of turning sequestered carbon into carbon released in the airshed? How would you look at the biomass energy part of the equation?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've been working on a project up in the San Juan Islands, a biomass energy project up there. And I'm a big fan of woody biomass energy, especially in the Northwest, where we live in a region that produces biomass unlike anywhere on this planet. So I think being able to utilize woody biomass as an alternative, of course, to fossil fuels is a tremendous win for us. And there's an argument to be made that woody biomass is a carbon neutral source of energy, since we're able to almost immediately recapture that carbon back into growing forests. Huge conversation there that we don't have time for right now, but big fan.
Yeah, well, I think that question could be looked at from both perspectives, because you think about burning wood for energy, then you are releasing CO2. So, there's that kind of a conundrum there. Big question, as you said. If someone's looking to get into active forest management as a career, what would be the best road to take? That's another big question.
Yeah, right. Well, certainly schooling to begin with. I think it depends on what you want to do, what you mean by career. If it's field forestry, being a consulting forester, you definitely need to get some field technical skills under your belt. And there are any number of universities and community colleges in the Northwest that at a minimum provide a 2-year forestry technician degree. My organization hires forestry technicians on a regular basis, kind of helps get some more training for you get out into doing some other work. But lots of other ways to get into forestry, at the policy level, working with conservation groups, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the first is kind of define exactly what it is you want to do.
Okay, another question: how does biochar fit into your view of forest stewardship, especially with fuels reduction?
Boy, I got all these questions that we could build an entire presentation around. Biochar, I'm fascinated by biochar. Again, we've also done a lot of work in the San Juans in converting what we consider to be excess forest biomass in these overstocked forests that are in a highly fire-dependent ecosystem. The question is, if we're going to thin these forests, what do we do with that material? We can't leave it in the forest. So one option is biomass energy. And we have done a lot of work on creating biochar. Incredibly labor intensive to do at a small scale. And I think the ecological benefits of it at a small scale, the relationship between labor and benefit is a very difficult equation to get to pencil out. We need some larger scale manufacturing options that are accessible to a broader range of forest owners. I think it's something that science in the forest sciences we really need to look at, because with the interruption of fire cycles, we've interrupted the natural and regular replenishment of charcoal in forest soils. And we're beginning to learn how important charcoal is for nutrient retention, moisture retention, and all sorts of other ecological benefits. So a very understudied realm of ecological forestry that's just begging for somebody to dig into.
There was one more question kind of related to the biomass energy, which is ethanol from woody biomass, and if that's something of interest for another way of dealing with the debris or the fuels reduction.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I'm a tremendous advocate of woody biomass as an alternative to fossil fuels. You know, it's the fuel source of our region, and we are developing technologies for clean burning and clean manufacturing. I wish that this would be a place for more public investment.
All right, I think with that we'll go on. There's one more question that popped up, but we'll get that in the next round.
Okay,
that
sounds good.
To you. Okay.
All right, absolutely. Okay, moving on. Now let's get into climate change. So a few years ago, my organization hosted a series of seminars on the topic of climate adaptation for Northwest forests and published a guidebook for forest managers. The guidebook and all of the presentations are on our website. They're a tremendous body of useful information. During her overview presentation on climate change in the Northwest, Jessica Holofsky, a climate research scientist with the Washington DNR, presented this slide. Now, I interpret this slide like this. If we get our shit together as a global community and enact meaningful measures to combat carbon emissions, then average temperatures in the Northwest will still go up an anticipated 2 to 5 degrees over the next 80 years. Now, conversely, if we don't get our shit together, then temperatures may increase by as much as 5 to 13 degrees. And under this latter business as usual scenario, this translates to the Puget Sound where I live, experiencing similar temperatures as Sacramento, California. Think about that. Now, I like Sacramento, but I'd rather visit there than have it come here. Some of the other results of the climate modeling, the overall prediction of rainfall is that the Northwest will likely continue to receive the same annual amount, but it will be even more concentrated during winter months with longer, drier summers. Weather events are anticipated to become more extreme. I think we're seeing that, which directly translates to more severe weather-driven disturbance events. Warming temperatures may trigger insect outbreaks, may make new diseases viable in our forests, and could set the stage for more frequent, larger scale forest fires. Now, it's very likely that we're already beginning to see the impacts of climate change in our forests. I've personally noticed a dramatic increase in tree mortality across the Northwest, in particular amongst the least drought-tolerant species, such as western hemlock, grand fir, or western red cedar. The forests of British Columbia just endured a 20-year epidemic pine beetle outbreak that ravaged hundreds of thousands of hectares. We've endured several recent years of record or near record wildfire burns. So it's highly likely that climate change is exacerbating these occurrences. But I would also caution you not to point the finger entirely at climate change. Now, remember, our forests are in a highly disturbed condition due to a history of past management that has resulted in them currently being stocked at a very high density compared to the long-term carrying capacity of a site. So for tree species that can take hundreds of years to develop to maturity, there are very few forests in the Northwest that have even achieved 100 years of age since being first cut, and are, biologically speaking, still in a relatively early successional stage. They're young. A lot of the mortality we're currently seeing in our forests may therefore very well be the outcome of natural processes of self-thinning and species adjustment, and we are essentially finding ourselves in the middle of the competitive mortality phase of forest development. So this doesn't mean we can just breathe a sigh of relief and say, oh, don't worry, Mother Nature has it covered. Remember that these early stages of forest recovery can also make forests more vulnerable or prone to disturbance, in particular fire. We often live in forested landscapes. We want a sustainable provision of forest products and ecosystem services, and we don't want to see our forests endure catastrophe. So I was invited recently to Bainbridge Island to work with the land trust there to assess their forests and make management recommendations. Over recent years, they were seeing a rapid increase in tree mortality, in particular cedar, across many of their forests, and they were becoming increasingly concerned about the health of forests in general across the island. Now, Bainbridge Island is essentially a large glacial moraine left behind by the Vashon Glacier when it retreated approximately 14,000 years ago. And most, if not all, of the primary forests on that island were cut by the 1920s to feed the mill at Port Blakely, once the largest lumber mill in the world. Replanting laws weren't required until the 1940s in Washington, so most of the current forests on the island are comprised of a dense hodgepodge of naturally regenerated conifers and hardwoods. One of nature's strategies for colonizing a site is to throw a lot of seed at it from a lot of different plants. What happens then is you get a broad mix of species, all of which may not necessarily be suitable for the site in the long term. For instance, western red cedar, grand fir, hemlock are not particularly drought-tolerant trees. The fact that we're seeing an increase in mortality amongst these species on droughty, glacially dry soils may have more to do with their unsuitability for the site. And the forest stands in which they occur are going through a natural process of selective thinning as the less drought-tolerant trees gradually fade from the droughty sites and are replaced by more drought-tolerant species such as Douglas fir, pine, Pacific madrone, maple, oak. However, this self-thinning process is contributing a lot of dead and dry wood to a historically fire-prone ecosystem that people now occupy at a high density. Okay, I finally want to transition to talking about the art and science of applied ecological forestry. So I distill the practice of ecological forestry into two fundamental principles. Right tree for the right location, and stocking density, or how many trees there are in a given area. So we must think very carefully about the long-term viability of tree species for a particular site, as I just described. As our climate changes, some sites may get wetter, some sites may get drier. Some sites may be shadier, some sites may be more exposed. Like any organism, trees have a range of preferences relative to soil type, moisture, and sunlight, and a range of tolerance. And so what we're likely seeing now is the range of tolerance for all trees shrinking. So we must also be conscious of how many trees there are and of what species. By recognizing both compatibilities and competition between trees, we begin to understand what happens with forests at various stocking levels. So if we can agree on four things, most of our forests are in a disturbed condition relative to their historic norm. Most of our forests are overstocked relative to the long-term carrying capacity of the site. The future climate regime will be different from the past and may support even fewer trees per acre. And lastly, doing nothing may incur increasing risks for most forests. Then it should stand to reason that one of our best strategies for improving the condition of our forests is, again, thinning, the selective cutting of specific trees. How we go about doing this, I believe, then, is the central practice of ecological forestry. Regardless of what our objectives may be, I think every forest owner or manager will say that they want a healthy forest. However, forest health quickly becomes a very specious term, as it commonly is used or has anthropogenic connotations. For instance, we often define forest health in terms of factors that either limit or enhance the ability of a forest to provide what humans want, such as timber. Now, I prefer to use the word resilience. In terms of forest ecosystems, resilience refers to the ability to adapt to and recover from disturbance, in particular climate change. So the goal of ecological forestry then is to manage forests that are resilient and productive. So if we can accept the argument that thousands of years of successional development has led to forest ecosystems that are both productive and resilient to disturbance, then I believe that one of the most instructive models we can have for how to manage our forests are the effects of natural disturbance regimes. And we should design a system of silviculture that emulates, to the extent possible, those effects. In my way of thinking, the basic elements of ecological forestry are therefore mimic natural forest processes, improve forest structural diversity and biodiversity, increase ecological capital and ecosystem services, restore ecological resilience, diversify financial values, and lastly, increase aesthetics, because who doesn't love a beautiful forest? So I want to conclude by taking you back through the successional processes of a forest, from disturbance to development of late serial characteristics and functions, but with the addition now of active management, so you can see the application of various principles of ecological forestry. I'm also going to share some very basic forest management costs and revenue projections from these different activities. Now, these are highly generalized and they're solely of value to showing trends, so they should not be taken literally. So let's start with the very beginning of a forest, what we often call stand initiation. Under an active management approach, we're going to come in and manually plant a site. Purposes or reasons for this is we want to rapidly colonize the site and begin optimizing the photosynthetic capacity of that site to produce biomass for timber or carbon sequestration. By manually planting, we can choose the appropriate species for that site, again, the ecological conditions, be it soils, weather regimes, et cetera, aspect, as well as for the goals of that site, whether it's primarily timber production or restoring biodiversity and habitat. Either way, we typically plant at a very high density, upwards of 400 trees per acre. And depending on the site conditions, this can cost around $450 to $600 per acre. That's going to vary depending on if we're caging trees, and also does not necessarily include site preparation costs, as depending on the kind of site we're dealing with, there can be a very expensive preparation costs. So this takes us through the first, I would say, 15 years or so now of stand growth, again, what we call stand initiation. As a graphic representation, we have now the newly planted stand on the left at 400 trees per acre. And then again, for the sake of argument, our desired future condition of the roughly 50 trees per acre in an old growth forest. And these circles, I'll continue to show these over time, represent the 20th acre plot in the forest. So some other considerations at the stand initiation phase. One climate adaptation strategy that's gaining attention is the concept of assisted migration. And this refers to planting tree seedlings obtained from a location that is representative of the future climate of a particular planting site. The U.S. Forest Service has developed a web-based tool called the Seed Lot Selection Tool that allows you to enter your location and then see the current locations that are representative of the future climate of your site. You can then look for tree nurseries in those locations. My organization is involved with a couple of different assisted migration projects. One higher elevation project at the Nisqually Community Forest near Ashford, and another, the Stossel Creek project near Duvall, Washington. And you can read about the latter on our website. We're in the third year of monitoring at Stossel Creek. of a wide range of tree seedlings obtained from various nurseries in Southern Oregon and Northern California. Okay, so now the next phase of forest growth, sometimes both referred to as the competitive exclusion phase or the stem exclusion phase. The stand now is 15 to 25 years old, highly stocked, and our first silvicultural activity is pre-commercial thinning. And the point of pre-commercial thinning is to accelerate the self-thinning process of the site and to adjust the natural species or adjust the species for that site. So really what we're trying to do is skip over the stem exclusion phase and accelerate growth of individual trees, the ones that we leave behind. This can also be used to improve timber value and maintaining optimal growth and the most dominant and/or preferred species on the site. And again, adjusting species for the site is very important at this step. We're going to take out about 40 to 50% of the trees, so dropping the stocking from 400 to roughly 240 trees per acre. This will vary depending on species and on site conditions. But during this pre-commercial thinning process, we can already start doing some things to increase the heterogeneity and the habitat complexity of that stand. For instance, we can take small diameter poles and stack them all together like you see at the front of this picture to create constructed down logs that emulate to a certain degree the habitat functions of the old growth logs that once were on this site. In the back of that picture is a textbook example of a wildlife habitat pile with poles stacked on the bottom and slash or branches on top. Same thing, provides some additional habitat structure within these forests, and it helps reduce some of the fire risk by aggregating this fire-prone material. Okay, so we're going to skip ahead again now, another 15 years of stand growth. Still a very young forest compared to the biological potential of the site, and still in the stem exclusion or competitive exclusion phase. As the trees grow up, canopy closes again, there's going to continue to be a lot of competition within this stand. So now our next thinning entry is a commercial thinning entry, and we refer to it as thinning from below, that I'll get to in just a minute. The point of this thinning is, again, to continue to accelerate the self-thinning process by further reducing stocking densities and favoring the most dominant trees that are suitable for the site. Very similar strategy as the pre-commercial thinning. Again, this is usually best done commercially, and under today's market conditions, depending on where you're at, in proximity to mills, you should be able to generate anywhere from $500 to $750 an acre of net revenue back to the landowner. So I mentioned the term thinning from below, and what that means is that we are coming in now and thinning out some of the trees that nature is already selecting out. So we'll be taking out some of the suppressed trees, some of the intermediate trees, and to a lesser degree, some of the co-dominant trees. We may take out a dominant tree if it will release a vigorously growing understory tree, but by and large, we're thinning from below. We're taking out the trees that essentially nature is already going to be thinning out of that stand. At this thinning entry, we're only taking out about 30% of the trees, so dropping the stand from 240 trees per acre down to around 180 trees per acre. And some other things that we can do during this, this thinning entry to enhance wildlife habitat or protect it is to retain any snags that are existing on the site or start creating snags by reaching up with the logging equipment and snipping that tree off as high as possible. If there are old legacy structures in the forest, be it old stumps, old snags, or even old growth trees, we will buffer those in order to protect the biological legacy that these structures present. Somebody asked the question about hardwoods. If hardwoods are present in the stand, we're going to try to protect those. One thing that we found, or biologists have found rather, is that bird species increase in both species and abundance along with the increase of hardwoods in the stand. So wherever we can, we'll protect those hardwoods and maybe even introduce hardwoods. Another trick that we use during logging is our skidders will take the logging slash from the landing where the logs are being processed back out into the forest and spread that slash out. They primarily put it on the skid trails So we're minimizing soil disturbance and soil compaction and also incorporating that organic matter into the soil. Or they may leave piles of that debris here and there to function as wildlife habitat piles. Okay, we're growing the stand out again, another 15, 20 years or so, now making our third thinning entry, but our second commercial thinning entry. At this point, we refer to it as variable density thinning. Again, we're still in that stem exclusion phase. Biologically speaking, the forest is still young, even though it's 50 to 60 years old. But at this thinning entry now, we can really begin working on creating more of a heterogeneous composition of the forest, both in species and in the stocking. Usually this kind of thinning will generate about $1,000 to $1,500 per acre of net revenue, again, give or take, depending on the conditions. And what this looks like graphically is you have the stand prior to treatment in the upper left, and in the bottom right is the post thinning or post treatment. And as you can see, this really represents variable density thinning. We retain areas of higher density, we thin to varying densities in other areas, and this is meant to create, again, overall a more heterogeneous forest composition. We're still taking on only about 30% of the trees, dropping from 180 down to 120. What we may do after this thinning entry, where we have thinned to a higher density, is come in and start some underplanting. You know, if we're not already getting natural regeneration in the understory of the forest, then we may decide to do some underplanting at this point. And again, getting in some more shade tolerant trees that are suitable for the site. But what we've often found is with these repeated thinning entries and the disturbance of the soils, that logging, we can use logging as a disturbance agent, and those exposed mineral soils present a seed bed. And we start stimulating with each thinning entry new cohorts of tree seedlings coming in the understory. These kind of thin stands also attract more snow at higher elevations, which can help retain more soil moisture. So now getting to our third commercial thinning, fourth thinning entry overall, still in the stem exclusion phase, but now we're getting some understory initiation, trees that are naturally regenerating in the understory. Still a variable density thin, still working on overall species and spatial composition, generating anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 an acre. In this particular thing, we were emulating a wind disturbance. So retaining trees at very different spatial compositions, creating some gaps in the forest, leaving different species, leaving a lot of wood on site, still taking out overall about a third of the trees, down to 80 trees per acre, now getting closer to our final stocking density. In either this thinning or even the prior thinning, we may start creating some gaps, basically punching some holes in the forest. And these gaps are representative or try to emulate wind disturbance events or disease pockets. And another benefit of these kind of gaps is you can replant them to get a new cohort of trees established. They help generate more revenue per acre, certainly by harvesting more timber. But also one thing that we're finding, and we have a study going on right now, is in creating some snow gaps up in the Nisqually community forest, we're looking at snow accumulation rates and the differences between snow accumulation in gaps and snow accumulation in the understory. And we've already found just in monitoring this year that there's a 40% increase in snow depth in these gaps. And we're hoping that this has positive implications for watershed hydrology by retaining more of that moisture higher in the watershed later into the season. So our final thinning entry, our fourth commercial thinning entry, fifth thinning entry altogether, is now what we call a variable retention harvest. This will be the last thinning of that original cohort of trees, generating anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 acres of net revenue. Again, taking out about a third of the trees on that site. And as you can see in this picture, perfectly illustrates the very robust understory regeneration that's occurring. The next thinning entry after this then will be of that understory cohort. And we in essence start the thinning process all over again. But at that point, we have got our original cohort down to our theoretical old growth legacy tree stocking density. So that is the summation of my presentation. I just want to end on one final positive note back to my family, Ma and Pa Hanson. Unfortunately, Pa Hanson is no longer with us anymore, but a fun quip of him. He was 94 years old, still working in the family forest, still walking around the brush with a machete, releasing his tree seedlings. And people always asked him, what's the key to long life? And he said, hey, just don't sit down for too long. So with that, I thank you, and I want to turn it back over to Glenn, and then I assume open up for some Q&A. Also, I have that video if you think there's time, but I know I'm running a little bit long, so if you prefer to put the link in the chat, we can certainly go that route as well.
Yeah, well, since you've actually put this slide up, just I think we'll break for questions, but wanted to point out that our next and actually last of the Tree School Online series for this season is April 12th, and it's going to feature Dave Bugney and his family forest story about what they've done to restore Suter Creek, healthy streams, a family's journey towards fish habitat restoration. So look out for that next month. And then I guess I'd ask you, Kirk, so, we got a fair amount of time. It's would you want to show that video, or you want to hold that for
yeah,
later?
well, let's do that if we've got the time here. Let me see if I can. It'll all be a matter of whether I can successfully queue it up or not. So if I fail at that, we'll move on. Let me see here now if I can find it again.
You said it was about 5 minutes.
Yeah, a little shy of 5 minutes, I believe.
All right, well, folks can take a screen break and stretch and take a deep breath and see how the technology works for you.
There we go. Okay, and share sound. All right, do you have the video up on the screen there, Glenn?
Yes.
Great, okay.
I'm Kirk Hanson, Director of Forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group.
I'm also on the board of directors of the Nisqually Community Forest, a community-owned and managed forest in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. We recently embarked on a new project here that's going to improve the health of the forest and provide lasting economic opportunities for the surrounding community. The lands around here are usually clear-cut at a young age, which is the preferred system for most commercial forestry operations.
Clear-cutting this forest really reduces the opportunities for this community. It will generate a significant amount of revenue, but then there's a long period of time when that revenue is no longer available.
It would also degrade wildlife habitat in the forest and the amount of carbon it's storing. We're doing things here a little differently. The model of forestry we're using, ecological forestry, is designed to achieve many more objectives than just short-term cash income. By selectively thinning the forest, we're removing some of the trees from areas where there's too much competition, which will allow the remaining trees to grow bigger, faster. This also leaves trees the community forest can harvest later to generate more revenue in the future.
In thinning the stand, we're reducing the stocking density. We're taking a forest that had 300, 400 trees per acre and bringing it down to 200, 220 trees per acre.
That's going to reduce the amount of water the trees demand, which is particularly important in a warmer, drier climate. As trees grow older, they transpire less moisture from the soil, allowing the ground to act like a water reservoir. By thinning and creating small patch cuts, we also open up the canopy of the forest, which will allow snowpack on the forest floor to melt slower throughout the spring, improving summer stream flows, critical for salmon. Parts of this forest are very dense, very uniform, without much of an understory, which makes for poor wildlife habitat. Thinning and gap creation will allow more light to hit the forest floor, which invigorates understory plants that sustain wildlife. We're also thinning in a way that improves vertical complexity in the tree canopy, retains habitat structures like snags and down logs, and allows a more diverse range of tree species to naturally regenerate. A big part of the Nisqually Community Forest Management Plan is bringing parts of the forest back to old growth conditions. Old growth forests perform key ecological functions like providing habitat for endangered species and storing vast amounts of carbon in wood and soil. Without management, this forest would have naturally thinned itself over the years, but it would take a long time. This harvest, on the other hand, is going to propel the forest toward old growth structure and functions faster than it would on its own. So, unlike clear cutting, where income is the main goal, this method of forestry balances a lot of objectives at the same time. We're setting up the forest to be more ecologically and economically resilient in the long term, while providing jobs for local forestry contractors and a sustained source of revenue for the community forest. That blend is called ecological forestry, and this is how we're putting it into practice.
All right.
All right, very good. So we're going to go ahead with some questions and answers. So there's quite a few here. I think you did address the question about hardwoods to some extent, and so unless there's another question about that, I think I'll move on to the next one. But maybe we'll get some nuance on that if there's time. The question was, will forestry jobs ever come back to rural forested communities? So kind of reflecting that total forestry jobs have gone down over the years. And I don't know what thoughts you have about the jobs provided by ecological forestry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one, I suppose, I don't know if it's offshoot ecological forestry, but I'm really intrigued by this growing interest in what are called community forests. I'm on the board and also the forest manager for the Nisqually community forest. And this, generally speaking, is an effort to try to bring forests that have been acquired by non-local entities back under local ownership, local management. So the management of those forests are really responsive to local communities, as well as creating more job opportunities. So yeah, as somebody who's been a lifelong forest manager and is raising my kids to understand how to manage forests, I certainly hope that through this more diversified approach, like I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, that there'll be more diverse opportunities for jobs and livelihoods within Northwest forests. I see the two going hand in hand just perfectly.
Another question about the management cycle there. Why plant so many trees, 400 trees per acre? Why not start with a lower density if the ultimate goal is reduced density? And will that competition weaken the trees back to that kind of overstock condition?
Yeah, it's a great question. The main reason for for overplanting is the expectation of mortality, whether it's deer browse, drought mortality, any other kind of factors. Rarely, I shouldn't say rarely, but it's increasingly challenging to get these young plantations to establish and to survive to the point where they begin providing the kind of ecosystem services and the forest products that we want. So it's not uncommon, I should say, to plant at 400 trees per acre. And by the time we get around to some of our first thinning, we've already lost 30%, 40% of those trees to various mortality agents. So if we only started out by planting at, say, 200 trees per acre, or even just 50 trees per acre, thinking, okay, that's our old growth stocking. But because of whatever kind of natural disturbance vectors come along, it wipes out a percent of the species. We got to kind of start over again. And I always tell people it's a lot less expensive to plant more trees at the beginning and thin them later than it is to come back to a site and try to replant again, because that site's going to get colonized by brush. And once it's, I think with brush, it's inordinately expensive and complicated to try to reclaim it back into trees again. So the whole point, and this is really, again, following a natural disturbance or forest succession model is on a disturbed site where the soils are disturbed, nature will colonize that at a very, very high density, sometimes to the tune of, hundreds of trees, 1,000 trees per acre in the case of alder. And so and then goes through that, again, that self-thinning. So we're trying to kind of follow or mimic that initial stand initiation, colonization, natural process.
The next question is, what about the role of fire in the site prep? So given that a lot of the forests regenerate from fire disturbance, where's the role of fire in ecosystem or ecological forestry?
Well, not to be too cavalier or I guess too general, I should say, is boy, complicated. We do understand on the west side of the Cascades, at least, that they still are, fire was a natural event here, a much longer return interval, could be several hundred years on a particular site versus every, 10 years or less on the east side, but still a significant role. I personally don't feel that there is a role for, say, controlled burning or reintroduced fire in most places on the west side. I think it's too complicated. We're too developed here. And given the kind of long fire return interval, what west side forests do, unlike east side, is they build up an extraordinary amount of biomass. And that's one of the reasons why when we do have fires, they're so much more catastrophic than we may realize. Is you've had decades, if not several hundred years, of biomass accumulation, and so when the weather events are just right, you get these absolutely massive catastrophic fires. So that's a tricky one. Definitely a role for controlled fire on the east side or on some of the very dry microclimates. Say Fort Lewis up here in the South Puget Sound, the San Juan Islands, something like that, where you don't have a built environment, in amongst the forest. But this is another argument for biochar, is to what extent can we emulate the natural disturbance effects of fire through active management?
Okay, where does the laminated root rot fit? Does it work like a natural disturbance, or is it just a negative?
Yep, absolutely. I put that in the category of disease. So definitely a natural disturbance event. And what does root rot do? It creates snags, which provide habitat for hundreds of species of wildlife and insects. It punches a hole in an otherwise homogeneous stand, creates opportunities for other tree species, other plant species, shrubs to proliferate. So a couple things, we can, when we find root rot in a stand, we do not try to completely suppress it or isolate it. We thin in that area to try to increase the vigor of the trees to resist the root rot, take out the most obvious trees that are infected if they have good timber quality, so we're still salvaging that value. But my euphemism for root rot is that it's an agent of stand diversification, and I think it is once you manage with root rot or along with it, you reduce some of the conflict that we often have about root rot. If you don't have root rot, we can emulate it, and this is back to my gap creation comments in there, that we can come in and punch a hole in the stand, leave a few trees scattered through that to essentially emulate the effect of root rot, come back in, underplant that site with other species, increase the harvest volume production from that particular site. So kind of two different ways to approach dealing with root rot.
Okay, we're going to keep going with the questions, but I'm going to launch our exit poll, and we're not going to share the results, but just while we're finishing Q&A, if you have a chance, just answer questions about what you thought of the webinar today and if it's useful. So go ahead and do that at your leisure. And then we'll keep going with questions. Actually, one question, can we access this talk and share it with other small forest owners? So answer is definitely yes. So these webinars are recorded and then they're going to be on. The easiest way is to just share a link when the video gets posted. Probably by next week, there'll be a YouTube video and then the resources that Kirk is going to provide for references about this. Then just sharing the link to that webinar on our OSU Extension Tree School site. And you can access that through the Know Your Forest Tree School online site to get the recordings. So a
You
couple
know what
of
I'll
ways
say,
that
just to underscore that, like Glenn mentioned, I did put together a resource sheet, mostly of publications from which I've drawn a lot of the statistical information that's behind my presentation. So the resource sheet should really match the main topics in my presentation. So you can look for that when Glenn and Julie get this posted online in about a week, I think they said.
Okay, very good. Another question here was about pesticide use. Where does that fit into your management?
Well, I don't know if you literally mean pesticide or herbicides or just chemicals in general. I've never used pesticides to date to try to control pests or insects. Herbicides, it's been a long path to acceptance of herbicide for me. There are some sites where I think herbicide is just inappropriate application. If you're trying to reforest anything where there's grass, fields, pasture, what have you, incredibly difficult to get those sites recolonized without herbicides. Same thing if you have a proliferation of noxious invasive species. Himalayan blackberry, Scotch broom, I think are call for herbicide use. And ideally just a one-time short-term application to get your seedlings up through that competition. I have taken a completely manual approach to all of this for the past 25 years of my career. And I'm just coming to realize that there are some sites that you will either spend an enormous amount of time and money trying to manually coax back into forest, or it will just fail altogether if you don't use herbicides in a very judicious manner.
Okay, another question raised, and one that I was going to ask anyway. With the repeated entries, you run the risk of compacting the soil and damaging trees and degrading conditions. So it seems like how do you address that? The consequence of having all those repeated entries. Every time someone goes in with a big machine is a chance to do damage, as well as obviously achieve your silvicultural objectives.
Yeah, absolutely. It really comes down to operations. This is the careful conversation and dance between our foresters and a very hand-picked select group of logging contractors that specialize in thinning. We have a saying that every thinner is a logger, but not every logger is a thinner. You've got to find the right logger with the right mentality and the right kind of equipment that understands how to extract timber in the lowest impact manner possible. We look at residual damage of these contractors. We control that very carefully. We stop work if there's excessive damage to retention trees, to soils. And there's a whole art to laying out a harvest unit where you're not operating on every square foot of ground out there. And by repeated entries, we can lay in a network of main skid trails that continue to get used during each thinning entry. With equipment now, they can reach a considerable distance into the stand. Like I mentioned, we're carrying all the slash backouts. The equipment is operating on top of that slash. We use the right kind of equipment depending on the season. On wet clay sites, we are not logging in the wintertime. We may choose between a track skidder or a rubber tired skidder, depending on soils. Kind of on and on. There's a lot of operational things that we can do to minimize soil disturbance. And then at the same time, we just have to accept that if we are going to have a sustainable logging operation on a site, a sustained logging operation on a site, we're going to have to tolerate some soil disturbance and the consequences of that. We just can't get away from it. And that's where I say it's important to have some sites that are not disturbed, that are left to their own devices.
This one's not particularly a question, but just an observation. One of our landowners in Northwest Oregon talking about his dad, who passed away 20 years ago. The lifelong forest manager had objectives that leaned towards economics, but he was an early advocate of multi-entry thinning, just as the presentation today. So as you were saying earlier, there's a long-standing knowledge and art and science of this kind of practice. It's not particularly new, but it's something we're still learning as we go, right? Well, very good. I think we've run out of live questions here at this point. And I can't think of anything in particular else. Last chance for questions from the audience. Just there are some thank yous here in the chat and the Q&A. So that
I'd encourage anybody who wants to continue to learn more about ecological forestry, certainly visit our website, nnrg.org. And we send out a monthly newsletter that's chock full of information, resources on ecological forestry, events happening throughout the region. You can sign up for that newsletter at the bottom of the homepage of our website. And just our website alone is a treasure trove of information on ecological forestry. Actually, most of the links that I put in my resource sheet link back to our website, publications we have, blog articles we have, things like that. So the gal that runs our website has just been brilliant in turning that into an absolute encyclopedia of ecological forestry.
Actually, there's a question here. Will the Q&A be part of the YouTube presentation? And to the extent that we are saying this out loud, it is being recorded. So that it will show up. Some of the written stuff in the background and the Q&A, won't be preserved, but that's why we're repeating the questions and doing this so the audio gets recorded. So that'll be there. And then as he was just describing his website and the resources, so if you go back and find our posting of this after the fact, you'll be able to contact Kirk and you'll see the website. You can sign up for the newsletter. So, well, I wanted to thank you, Kirk. It's great. We've been meaning to do this for a while, to have to hear your story about ecological forestry. So I'm glad we had a chance to do it. And probably the next time around, we might hope to have it at a live tree school. But you can also go up to Washington, because at Kirk, you'll see on the website, there's a lot of events that happen up there when you get back on the ground, as well as your own webinars and other online resources. So thanks again, Kirk.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity, Glenn and Julie. Great to be here. And yeah, I look forward to tree school in person, hopefully next year.
Yeah, we're hoping so. So thanks everybody else for coming, and definitely look for more tree school in the future. So goodbye, everyone.